Started. So welcome everybody to the webinar. We're going to be talking about taking the UK's road network to net zero. Specifically, we're going to be talking about a piece of work we've been doing in national highways, which run a subset of that network, and I'll cover that a bit more in detail. I'm James Peet. I sit in the planning advisory business in the UK for WSP. It's about 2,500 people. And within that, I sit in the climate change and sustainability team, which is about 130 people. And we've been in the really fortunate position of being able to work on this great piece of work, which I'm going to talk about today. The slides are available. They're in the handout section of the webinar, and we'll have time for questions at the end. So if you want to use the chat function, please drop your questions in there as we go, and we'll be able to get to those at the end of this. So to kick off, a bit of context. In the UK, surface transport is the largest single source of greenhouse gas emissions, and we have nationally legislated for carbon budgets. To meet those, we're going to have to see fast action reducing emissions in line with those budgets to hit net zero in 2050, which is again what the UK has legislated for. Given that surface transport is now the largest single source of emissions, there's a fair amount to do. Within that context, we've been helping National Highways, which is the English major road operator. They operate 7,000 kilometres of road, and they provide a vital service within the UK. People travel further by road than any other form of transport in the UK. Almost 90% of passenger miles are done on that network, are done by road, and 80% of freight is taken by that road. That's that road system as well. What that means is we're not going to get to net zero by getting rid of the roads, but the roads are going to have to be net zero. But we shouldn't forget that the roads are part of a wider network. That wider network reaches beyond England into the rest of the UK. And also, it's not just a road network, it's a transport network within which rail and also other forms of transport play a part. Specifically to National Highways, they've been experiencing legal challenges. These cover their funding settlement and individual road schemes. The reason for this is that the legally binding carbon budgets need to be met, and it needs to be possible for them to show that their plans are aligned to this. We've therefore been helping them. We've written the plan in consultation with National Highways. This is now called the 2030-40-50 plan. And that process started about 2 years ago now, and has led to the publication of the report, which can be found on the internet. We did this by working very closely for a 3-stage process. We first asked the question, where's National Highways now? That was a scoping question to take the temperature of the level of ambition within National Highways, where the pain was being felt, and where the data and other underlying factors that we needed to look at had gotten to. Based on that, we could understand where National Highways is now and where it needs to be to get to net zero on a timeline which is both robust, credible, but also ambitious. And that leaves a gap. And there were lots of actions needed to fill that gap. So we then went into the second phase where we built out what are those activities that will bring down emissions in line with the ambition that the organisation has. That process took, I think, 4 or 5 months. And then we got into the real meat of how we built that plan, which was the final third phase of that, which was the refining phase. That probably took a further 6 months. And we iterated the plan through really close senior stakeholder engagement with the National Highways executive directors in particular, so that we would go around a loop refining that plan so that it wasn't a plan written and built by consultants, but a plan really owned and signed off on and understood by the leaders of the business. Fundamental to that was making sure that we anchored all of our work back to the science and the data, that we allowed the facilitation of that stakeholder engagement to result in leadership. And we kept the consultation broad so that the plan was clearly owned. And we didn't just ask, what do we need to do? But we very clearly articulated how we would do it. And that resulted in about 40 really clear and tangible actions that National Highways would take. Since then, we've moved into an implementation phase. It's split into 2 different parts. We're providing technical services. Those things include helping with strategic decisions, so supporting that continual stakeholder engagement and understanding what net zero and carbon means for the business. Also helping them work with their data journey. Everybody's on a journey with carbon data, and we're helping support them with that. And finally, PAS 2080, which is the standard for managing carbon in the supply chain. We're helping them follow best practice methods for that. Finally, those 40 actions that we put in place have become a major program of change across National Highways, and we're supporting them with program management services to do that. To give you a bit more of a picture of what that looks like, what we have is in 2030 a net zero target that covers their direct emissions. So that's emissions from their corporate operations. For 2040, we have a target to be net zero for their construction and maintenance activities. And then for 2050, for all of the vehicles using the network to be net zero. And it's particularly that last target where they have influence over more than just the English network they operate. It's beyond the major roads into the minor roads. It's beyond England into Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland. And it's also across multiple transport modes, so into active travel, rail, and others. So there are some specific activities which they're undertaking. So those commitments, what they look like is in their corporate emissions space, to make sure that their vehicles themselves are electric by 2030, switching over their lighting to more efficient sources, reducing their office space, starting to generate their own renewable electricity, and then across their land holdings, planting more trees to lock carbon away. They own quite a large amount of land. It's equivalent to the island at the bottom, the Isle of Wight. So they have a big opportunity to expand the amount of forested area. And then in maintenance construction, they're looking to build less and use digital solutions to help them do that. They're going to make sure that all of the vehicles and their compounds on their sites and delivering to their sites are zero carbon using alternative fuels. They're working with the supply chain to make sure that there are available net zero materials and products that can be used on their sites, and using a demonstrator project to drive that innovation before the target. Linked into providing those solutions, they're also going to put in place this carbon management system. That's what I alluded to before with PAS 2080. The idea there is that by working collaboratively and closely with the supply chain through a set of incentives, the supply chain will be able to make decisions on a case-by-case basis, balancing up the needs of the projects that they're working on to achieve their targets, using the solutions which are available due to the research and the co-working with the supply chain against those net zero materials and their construction plant vehicles that they're doing. So part of the idea is that we bring the solutions to the supply chain with some help, and then we ask the supply chain through a process around carbon management to then use them on the projects. Finally, we have the road user piece. So this is very much enabling broader systemic change around transport. So a big part of that is the switch over to EVs and supporting that. So it's making the EV experience better. So that's around making sure that the motorway service areas are more comfortable and EV charging works. It's supporting the work of the government to make sure that there are at least 6 fast chargers per service area so that people can charge their vehicles. It's about helping those service areas have energy storage capacity so that they can deal with peak charging demand. It's making sure their people are trained to deal with traffic officers. It's also about making sure that public transport and modal shift is prioritized within the work that national highways do, and helping to understand how HGVs are going to decarbonize. It's a bit trickier because we're not sure if the final technology will be batteries, hydrogen, potentially electric road systems, or a combination of all of those for those larger vehicles. So helping by having trials and demonstrators to understand better where the future lies and then planning for that. To do all that, there are some enabling activities that need to be undertaken. You need to have a strong central team resourced to make sure that that program of works is implemented, and that plan of works needs to be governed. There needs to be a clear accountability and ways for dealing with interfaces and escalations. Data is critical, and a plan for making sure that it's robust and can be improved so that we can track KPIs and performance across that program is critical. Any major program is a large piece of change. So that needs a really clear and consistent drumbeat of communication to help all of the people across the large organization and beyond that we're going to experience change around this subject matter understand the reasons why and what's expected of them within that, and the reason why they should be on the journey with us. Finally, the next kind of step of that is then the skills piece, in that if we're asking new things of people, having a really strong plan to implement upskilling across not just their own people, but the supply chain is also critical to success. So we've also been working across those areas. It's been 1 year, just over, since the plan was published. We've got some successes already. There's a few here. I won't bore you with quite all of them. But there's already a successful LED fit out program in place, a program to upgrade their fleet to more electric vehicles, as well as the purchase of renewable electricity, helping bring down corporate emissions. In the maintenance construction space, they've done an amazing job by implementing this carbon management system and have just been through their first round audit with that, and it's going very well. They generated a huge long list of low carbon solutions, opportunities through their innovation workshops, and a closer publishing roadmaps on their key materials as to how they'll decarbonize. Then in the net zero transport space, pretty much all of their people are trained on dealing with EV breakdowns already. Work has already been happening in terms of trials, and they'll be reporting on that. And there's also preliminary work supporting with the work at motorway service areas to support electric vehicles. So what does this mean for others? We can already start to learn some lessons as to what's worked well and what's been more challenging across this exciting piece of work. Having a plan at the beginning is really critical. By having that clearly articulated 40 tangible commitments with a time against them allows us to know what we need to do to get to net zero. And that plan then follows through into everything we can do. As I mentioned before, having the right resources in place is also critical. Without having a central team, internal, who can cheerlead and drive a program of change, it'll be really hard to get anything done. Clear governance and accountability is also crucial, but also leadership. Without a team of leaders behind the plan and behind the change, it's very difficult to get action across a wide range of different business areas involving lots of people. So on the one hand, we need to be able to have a process to hold people to account and to work with them, but also leadership is key so that everybody involved in the change can see where that's coming from. Pace is also important. Change is hard. People don't necessarily want to change what they're doing. It's quite easy to keep the pace high in the world of climate change, given that we need to change quickly. And doing so helps us to keep inertia out of what we're doing. It's also important to stay outcome focused. Modeling, planning, coming up with trajectories, writing plans, it's really, really important. But until we actually deliver, we haven't changed anything. So focusing on those outcomes is crucial. Data is also fundamental. We need to know what's happening with our KPIs to keep that program on track. But also, we don't want to accidentally end up making claims about our emissions reductions that don't play out. So having robust, clear data that sits behind what we're doing and what we're communicating, again, is crucial. As I've alluded to before, National Highways, just like any other organization, is not an island unto itself. Suppliers are a really important part of the journey. And we need to be clear in how we communicate with suppliers about what's expected of them and give clear, consistent market signals about where investment can be made, which will then help with the net zero journey. For example, if a cement manufacturer is looking at carbon capture and storage, there's a huge capex associated with that. But having a clear plan from a major client articulating when they expect to be purchasing that type of material on what basis helps unlock investment within the supply chain. And then finally, the most critical piece is around people. You know, any piece of large change has an impact on how people work. And when you're working across any large organization, that leadership that we need also needs to translate into day-to-day how people are working, and helping them understand that, again, that drumbeat of communication so that everyone can have the right skills and be empowered to make the decisions to cut carbon is critical. I couldn't probably emphasize that last piece enough. So to wrap up, Net zero is a challenge in every country, and infrastructure has a critical role to play in that. In the UK, the largest source of emissions is transport, surface transport in particular, and therefore National Highways has a major role to play in that, given that it operates England's network. And through the plan that they have, they will be able to generate change beyond just their own operations into their supply chain, and then beyond even their own network into the entire transport system of the UK. The work we've done with National Highways is hopefully a good example of a practical experience of getting on with the job, putting in place some tangible actions and delivering upon them. Making action together as a team and focusing on people is the key to success. Thank you very much for listening. I think we're going to open the floor for questions now. Karina, do you have any questions?
Yeah, I shared them in.
And they're in the chat. Real. Sorry, a bit slow of me. So number one, the concept of net zero is quite complex. What does it mean for National Highways, and how do we communicate this? That's a great question. So yeah, I mean, absolutely. The concept is a little bit contested even now. When we wrote the plan, we followed the SBTi definition of net zero, which was still being consulted upon when we wrote it. Things are improving. We now have a consultation around a formal ISO standard for net zero. But we took that definition, which means that to be net zero, you have to reduce your emissions about 90% before offsetting, and that you need to cover your supply chain, which is why we've looked at their own emissions, but we've also looked at the supply chain and even beyond that into road user. In terms of communicating that, in the plan, we had a particular page dedicated to explaining what net zero means for National Highways, to be really clear and authentic about the fact that it's a journey. We don't have all the answers now, but that we're taking quite a robust line around reducing emissions, not just paying for offsets. It's a genuine, challenging effort to reduce emissions, and so we were just as clear as we could about that. I hope that answers that question. Then number two, how do we reconcile these important targets with the request for coming back into the office full time? Shouldn't we be pushing for greater working from home policy and increased flexibility? I think that's a really great question, and the balance is difficult to strike, and it is on a case-by-case basis. WSP in the UK did some research a little while ago on the carbon emissions associated with office versus home working. Some quite interesting results. Again, it was specifically a UK context. That does change depending on the country. But in the UK, where most of our heating in domestic settings is related to gas, we found that during the summer months, it was better to work from home because that travel, which does happen via a variety of ways. Personally, I cycle to the office, but others will have to use cars or other forms of public transport to get there. But that travel is a bigger issue in the summer rather than staying at home where you're not heating your home. But in the winter, that travel causes less climate change than staying at home and heating your home using gas. And I think that illustrates the point that depending on how you travel, depending on what the purpose is, we need to be flexible. We can't do everything in an office environment. It's not always best to be in an office environment. Sometimes we're not as efficient, but we can't do everything in this kind of format now on Teams. Sometimes you do need to get in a room together and work things through. So there needs to be a bit of flexibility around that from a climate change perspective. Again, hope I covered that one. Then to question number 3, we've got, of the 3 targets, which is the hardest to achieve and why? Which kind of think is quite a good question. In terms of the corporate emissions, which is the first one by 2030, that's the soonest. But because they have a lot of influence over those, and there's a reasonably well-trodden path now for organisations to reduce their own emissions, that's reasonably straightforward. It also helps that they have a large land holding, which will suck carbon out of the atmosphere. So then the road user piece is in line with the UK government's national target, and so they'll be helped by the national context there. So the middle one is probably the most difficult. The supply chain will need to change massively to deliver projects at scale that are zero carbon, and there's a lot that needs to happen to do that. So it's probably the middle one that is the most ambitious. There's a great question here. Wales wants to stop all construction of new roads in Wales unless absolutely necessary. Are there similar ideas in the rest of the UK? Great question. So in terms of Wales, I think they're about to publish their roads review. I was fortunate enough with National Highways colleagues to meet some of those in Welsh Government writing that review. So we'll see what comes of that. But I think the Welsh position is to stop all road construction until more is understood about options and what this means. So there may be other developments. In Scotland, there's an ambition to reduce vehicle kilometres by private transport by 20%. And then the English position is a little bit different. It's slightly less command and control, but not unambitious. There still is the requirement to be net zero by 2050. And I think that we should probably remember that in both the Scottish and the Welsh examples, the largest amount of travel will still happen in private vehicles. So it's not a completely anti-car sort of policy position that they've taken. But I think there is a fair amount to work through in all of the countries within the United Kingdom to see how this will play out. Wales and Scotland have taken one position, Northern Ireland another, and England another, and it will take time to see exactly where the balance between electric vehicles, reducing vehicle kilometres, modal shift and others plays out. Great question. We then have another question on the replacement of street lighting with LED lights is obviously a positive step. Most highways authorities achieved this several years ago. Why is it taking until 2027 to replace only part of national highway street lighting? Surely this should be a priority, and continuing with existing inefficient lighting is very wasteful of energy. Again, absolutely right to challenge national highways on the pace of that. But on the flip side, it is quite challenging to change them over in the context of the SRN. I have to admit, I'm not a road lighting specialist. I'm more of a net zero generalist. But my understanding from working with colleagues on that particular target is that closing sections of the network to allow cherry pickers and other things to go up on lights and change out the technology has quite a big safety impact. Also, obviously, closing sections of motorways and other major roads isn't undertaken lightly, and so keeping that pace going is difficult. I think it is a priority for them. They have quite a large bill associated with that electricity use, and of course it chimes with exactly what is going on here. 70% by 2027, given historic rates of changeover, is considered pretty ambitious within national highways, and that's in part why it's at that place. They'll still be able to be net zero in 2030 with that kind of level of changeover, and that's due to rolling out renewables and making sure that where they haven't rolled out renewables, that they're purchasing renewable electricity. So it's all part of that picture. But yeah, it's definitely still challenging even at that rate. So I think that's the last question. Thank you all very, very much for joining. I really hope you enjoyed what we were able to present on today, and I hope you all have a good rest of the day. Thank you for your time.